any sort of interruption. Okay, that's that recording started. So anyway, it occurred to me earlier today that it's over 2 years since we last held our face-to-face meeting. And while this online format does have some advantages and that people can join us from virtually anywhere, it would be really nice to get back to in-person events. We are in fact planning some outside activities this summer. And the first of that is at a walk at Woodhall Dean in East Lothian on 30th of April. And hopefully, well, yeah, more will follow. So do keep an eye on your emails and social media. Anyway, it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Rebecca Yahr of the Royal Botanic Gardens here in Edinburgh, who will give us an introduction to the world of Scottish lichens. Becky is a botanist and lichenologist with a wide experience of diverse habitats in the Americas and the UK. She had her first botanical job back in 1992 and graduated with a BSc in botany from UC Davis in California in 1994, after which she worked for several years as a botanist in Florida. She started to develop an interest in lichenology while studying for her PhD in botany and genetics at Duke University. And she's held several postdoc positions at St Andrews and the RBGE, and became a permanent staff member at RBGE in 2010 as a lichen diversity scientist. Since 2019, she has been co-chair of the IUCN Lichen Specialist Group. Her major current projects include work on the taxonomy and diversity of threatened montane lichens, particularly snowbed communities, dispersal of Atlantic rainforest lichens, and specificity as a driver in lichen symbiosis. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Becky, and if she can now share her screen.
That's great. Thanks very much, Colin. And thanks to everybody for showing up on this beautiful sunny day now that it's gone dark here in Edinburgh. It's a good night to have a little talk. So I'll share my screen and we can get going. I usually like to have people kind of interrupt me, I must say, when I'm giving talks. But so this time we're going to do it a little differently. And so questions can go in the chat, like Colin said, and I'll be able to pick those up after the talk is finished. So with Zoom, you probably know it's hard for me to see the chat at the same time that I'm sharing my screen. So unfortunately, I can't have the interruptions. So one of the comments from Colin was it's a little bit unfortunate, isn't it, that we have to do these talks this way, that we unfortunately can't be together in person. But I think one of the interesting things that's come through over the past couple of years, where we've all learned to have online conferencing at the touch of a button, is that a lot of people have really gotten interested in what's growing outside their back door, on their way to work, on their car, all sorts of different places where people are starting to approach natural history. And there's been a real upsurge in people getting into natural history for the first time. And so it may be that you're one of those people who's maybe just started to like lichens or noticed lichens for the first time, or possibly, I know some of I've got some familiar faces among the audience tonight. So even if you know something about lichens already, I hope that some of the themes that I'll cover tonight will have a new perspective on the world from the point of view of lichens, and hopefully there'll be something for everyone. So before we get started very much, I'll just start with a very basic question, right? You've probably all seen this thing growing on rocks nearby. It's a lichen. You probably all know it's a lichen, but what's a lichen? Because strangely, it's kind of a controversial topic. It has been since the 1880s and before, when people didn't really know what they were. And I think when you do a cross section of a lichen, like we have here on the top right of my screen, hopefully you can see my mouse moving around. Is anybody going to nod for me? Can you see my mouse? Yay, great. So this cross section is a cross section through the microscope, about 400 times magnification of the lichen we were just looking at. And it's quite a complex structure, isn't it? So when people first started looking at these, they didn't quite know what to think. Is it a plant? Is it a alga? Is it a fungus? Or finally, someone figured out actually it's a mixture of both, right? So lichens are essentially symbiotic fungi. And what they do is these fungi make quite complex structures to house their partner, which is a photosynthetic partner. Lichens, being fungi, are unable to make their own food. Fungi, like animals, can't make their own food. They need to rely on an external carbon source. Where do you get a carbon source? From plants, right? Plants or bacteria. And so fungi, over the long time that they've been out on the earth, have partnered up with plants in a whole bunch of ways. And lichenization is one of the ways that fungi and plants have partnered up so that the fungi can take advantage of the carbon source provided by the photosynthetic partner. And then that little tiny photosynthetic partner can take advantage of having a safe home to live in. And so let's just look at this cross section in a bit of detail, because it is complicated. And almost everything you see in this picture, from the pink layer and the translucent layer down to this gray and black layer below, that's all fungal material. And there's just this thin little sandwiched layer of green stuff. And so what's the green stuff? Look down to the lower left and you can see individual algal cells. Those are single-celled green algae. They take light and carbon dioxide, energy from the sun, a bit of water, and they make sugar to feed the fungus. Sometimes it might not be green algae, but it might be cyanobacteria. So you have different photosynthetic partners involved in different lichens, but we'll just call them algae for now, for short. And that fungus then makes these complicated structures to display and house their photosynthetic partners, because that's their food source. Very clever. They farm their own food in their body. So the symbiosis works like that. It's a bit of a handshake over time. You give me carbon, I'll give you protection. And what kind of protection is it? Well, it's protection from the sun. This kind of pinkish brown layer at the top is a pigment that the fungus localizes to the upper layer of that body to protect from UV light. If you're a single-celled alga, the UV incident light will just zap you pretty much and damage the DNA. So that little layer of pigment is really important for protection. So what else do the algae get? They get protection from herbivory, especially, and then they get their moisture content regulated very carefully, actually. So the interesting thing you can see with this section is that this gray area under the algae, you can't see through it very well. And that's because there's air bubbles, tons of little air bubbles in there, which is what's needed for photosynthesis. It's all about gas exchange, the uptake of carbon dioxide and the release of oxygen. So you need the air layer in there. So this fungus has created quite a complex structure, including regulation of moisture, regulation of airflow, protection from UV, protection from herbivory, and all in a single little package that you can hold in your hand. It's really amazing. So if you think about the fungus itself, look down on my lower right here, you can see what fungal cells are like. They're just little threads. They're microscopic tube-like structures, and they have a crazy way of eating. So I don't know if any of you have ever read the relatively new book that's out called, I'm going to forget the name of it, by Merlin Sheldrake, something about enchanted fungi. What's that new book? It's very good. Anyway, he kind of opens the window on fungi, and he had this nice way of explaining how fungi eat. And the way we eat is we open our mouth and we put food in, but the way fungi eat is they grow through their food and they digest it from the outside in. So they grow through their food. They have extracellular digestion. So if you imagine my arm is a fungus, it would be exuding chemicals on the outside, dissolving what it's growing through and then absorbing that. So that's a pretty neat trick that fungi can do. And that we'll come back to that in a little while. But what it means is when they have that extracellular digestion, they've got lots of great enzymes to do all sorts of digesting. They can access mineral nutrients in a way that plants can't. And so they're able to bring into their bodies all the other nutrients that they need just from atmospheric deposition, or sometimes possibly from the rocks they're growing on. There's one other word I need to introduce you to, which is this poikilohydric. That just means that the lichens are mirroring the humidity of their environment exactly. They can't regulate their internal moisture almost at all. So as soon as it gets dry, they get dry and photosynthesis shuts down. So they're very delicate and they're very responsive to their environments. So that's a lot of material to cover just in one slide, isn't it? So hopefully it won't be so heavy going forward. So the next thing then is which fungi do this? And the answer is a whole lot of fungi do this. almost all of them are cup fungi, like this orange peel fungus. Probably you've all seen the orange peel fungus, and its fruiting body is cup-shaped, isn't it? And so most lichen fungi are cup fungi. The thing about the lichen symbiosis is there's an external fungal partner that houses internal algal cells, right? If we diagram all the cup fungi across the whole tree of life, it looks something like this. This is just condensed down. We're talking about, hundreds of thousands of species condensed into this. And what you can see, hopefully, is on the right-hand side is some blue arrows and some green and blue boxes. All of those different places in the fungal tree of life is where lichen fungi exist. So they're not related to each other, all of them. There's a whole bunch of different lineages involved in that. And that's pretty interesting. That's true of most fungal lifestyles. So all the pathogens aren't related to each other, and all the mycorrhizal fungi aren't related to each other. Same with lichens, lots of different origins evolutionarily. There's one big lineage of lichens, and that's where the most of the lichens that you think of when you think of a lichen are. It's most of the diversity and most of the recognizable ones. And these are the lichens, right? If you're not a fan of a lichen, hopefully this slide will show you just how fantastic they are. They're beautiful, they're striking, and they're quite diverse. But interestingly, all of these lichens are from the same lineage. So the ones that you think about are all closely related. And they have these wonderful colors. You'll never guess what that's for, right? Protection. It's all chemical protection for one reason or another. But here's some examples of things that are not part of that big lineage, and they tend to be little black dots, okay? So anybody who knows the true diversity of cup fungi will know that actually a lot of them make little pimples, not cups. So here's these little black dots. This is a conspicuous lichen that's not in that main lineage, and that's one of the big ones. And then I don't know if you can just resolve these little teeny tiny black dots, but these are also lichen fungi. And some of them, so here's a tiny liverwort. Let's blow that up on the lower left. You can see the leaves of the liverwort, and here's another little tiny black dot, okay? And on the liverwort are some tiny green crumbs. So those are lichenized crumbs. And so there's a lot of lichens that look like this, little black dots. So when you really get into it, these are what you're going to be faced with. But I said that only 98% are cup fungi. The other 2% are mushroom formers. Maybe you didn't know that actually mushrooms can be lichens as well. So we think of mushrooms as being saprotrophs, or things that decay dead and dying material, dead material. But some mushrooms do other things, right? They'll be associated with plant roots, and then some mushrooms are associated with lichens. So this clump of sphagnum on the left has a green film overgrowing it. And if you zoom into that green film, you can hopefully resolve that these are made of little green blobs. And if you zoom in even further, those little green blobs are a complicated little structure of transparent fungal cells wrapped around of just a little cluster of algal cells. So mushrooms can be lichens too. So then just a quick review about lichens being symbiotic fungi. This picture in the background, I love this photograph. This is a machete blade in the tropical forest that has been abandoned for who knows how long, and the fungi had just grown over it in a beautiful fan. These are microscopic threads that are clustered together so you can see them, but you probably all recognize that growth form, the typical fungal growth form, radiating microscopic threads. And as I said before, they specialize in extracellular digestion, so digestion from the outside in. They can form these really fantastic protective structures, which you've seen as a lichen. And they have a whole bunch of these really interesting chemicals, which do interesting jobs inside the lichen. So we'll see more of these themes, but just as a little reminder, this is how the symbiotic fungi work. So what do they do out there in the big wide world, apart from entrance people like me? One of the main things that they do, of course, is they form the foundation of food webs. Effectively, they function like plants. They fix atmospheric carbon that's inaccessible. It's an inorganic inorganic carbon form that then becomes an organic carbon form and is eaten by little creatures. Lots of invertebrates, especially, but not all invertebrates. So this slide shows orobatid mites, and hopefully some of you will have seen these before. They're very cute little things, and they love to munch on lichens. So there's a lot of them out there. But lots of different invertebrates do this. It's not just mites by any stretch. And here's a lovely example I found when I was just browsing one day on the internet and found a beautiful painting of a peltigera, a dog lichen. The artist was busily painting her lichen when out pops a springtail. Springtails are very common, little creatures in damp places and dark places. And this particular springtail was lovely, so she painted that. And then she discovered, actually, it's a new species. No one had ever seen that springtail before. So there are wonderful homes that provide shelter and food for a variety of small creatures. Not all the creatures they provide shelter for are small. So this is one of the hair lichens. This is a Bryoria species. And in North America, there's some squirrels that build nests in trees out of Bryoria and Bryoria alone. So without Bryoria, the squirrels wouldn't have a home. And for those of you who are around in the maybe 90s and remember the gigantic controversy about the northern spotted owl in the Pacific Northwest, it was an endangered species that people got up in arms about. And the northern spotted owls only eat the squirrels that build their nests out of the Bryoria. So layers and layers of life all connected. Now this is a picture that could probably confuse you. If you look down at the bottom right, you might see some things that give you a hint about what this actually is a picture of. On the globe, we're in northeastern Canada. This is an aerial view of forest, taiga forest. So here's lakes at the top. These fantastic shapes are lakes. And then we have grayish white, they look like clouds, but really this is forests from above. And all the speckles are spruce trees. This is lichen forest. The ground cover here is almost completely lichen, and this is the home range of caribou. So in the wintertime, the caribou graze through here, and that's their winter forage. They'll paw through the snow to get to the lichens. So maybe you didn't realize just how much lichen is out there, but that's a lot of lichen. So here's a picture of our Scottish reindeer. And the herders up there in the Cairngorm reindeer herd will tell you just how much they love these things. They call sticks covered in lichens lichen lollipops, and they use them to effectively bribe the reindeer. So if they need to take medicine, they give them some lichens and help it go down. It's like a spoonful of sugar, but it's a lichen. So that's just a funny thing that they do. When I did a little experiment with these Cairngorm reindeer, and the experiment involved feeding them leaves and lichens. And I showed up in their pens with two bags, a bag of lichens in my left hand and a bag of leaves in my right hand. And they were invisible to the deer because they were in opaque bags. And as soon as I entered the pen, the deer would come straight over and start snuzzling against the lichens. They could sniff them out really easily. So they sniffed them out. It was very obvious to me how fast they could identify them, and they really are attracted to them and love to eat them. Here's our Scottish reindeer in their habitat on the Cairngorm Plateau. And here on the right-hand side is the little example of our own lichen woodland. So this is from Culbin Sands up near Forres in, I can't remember what county that is, Murray. So we have our own little bit of lichen woodland up there. If you've never been, it's worth going. It's quite a fantastic place. Of course, lichens are used as shelter and not just food. So I'm going to give you a minute. Can you find each of the animals hiding in each of my 4 pictures? Hopefully you'll start to see. Some of them are easier than others, right? Here's a gigantic katydid, colored green, and with lichen camouflage. It looks like, so a lot of lichens in the tropics grow on leaves. So they're called foliiculous lichens, and this katydid is very well camouflaged against its foliiculous lichens. Not only is it green like a leaf, but it's got the lichens on the leaf. We have a spider here. We have another spider here. And then we have a beautiful moth here, one of the pugs. So I could have given you lots and lots of examples of this, but there are a lot of invertebrates that are camouflaged with lichens. And here's one of my favorite camouflage examples. Hopefully some of you have been lucky enough to spot long-tailed titnests in your life. So in the Americas, hummingbirds always cover their nests in lichens. And I think it's all about camouflage. If you look at a stick like this, the lichens completely cover the stick, and the lichens have been torn off and glued onto their nests to camouflage them. If so, one of the biggest predators of nests in the Americas is snakes. And if you're a snake and you're looking up from below, you wouldn't see a nest, you just see a knot on a branch. And I have to ask if anybody's ever heard of anything sweeter than this. Just, you know, I'd be surprised. This is where I'd like to lie down, attached to a tree limb with spider silk, camouflaged with lichen, and lined with a soft bed of dandelion, cattail, and thistledown. How lovely is that? So that's hummingbird nests for you. So one of the other themes that comes up over and over again in lichens, what do they do out there in nature? Well, they provide a rich source of chemicals for themselves, for all sorts of reasons that I've already mentioned, but also for human use too. This bright yellow lichen, you can see this covering huge swathes of the dry sides of oak trees. When you're driving through the countryside at 60 miles an hour, you can see it go by. Whoop, there it goes. This is not a small lichen. It's in individually tiny pieces, but it covers huge areas. And this was used to dye candles, to make them a beautiful yellow color to kind of hide the ugly color of tallow. But of course, humans have used chemicals in lichens as dye stuffs for fabric as well. And this Ecological in the background here is one of the Corkier lichens, or the so-called cudbears, and they make rich purples, blues, and reds depending on the pH. So for a long time, this was one of the few sources of a really rich kind of crimson to blue color until synthetic dyes were created. So everything on the right here, these are all different lichen dyes, and they can be greens to browns, lots of colors. What else do they do? Well, I think one of the most important ecological roles they play is the colonization of bare rock. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but imagine if your life was restricted to a bare rock. If you could sit there and you had everything you needed just sitting on that piece of bare rock. You'd have a little bit of rain, a little bit of dust, and all the sugars that you need growing inside your body, and that's all they need. So that's why lichens are one of the first to colonize, because they're able to hold on and they don't need much from the outside. So how do they hold on? And this is about those microscopic fungal threads, right? On the right-hand side, you see a cross-section of a piece of granite. This is 5 millimeters deep of solid granite. On the top, there's a black layer, which is the lichen itself. So that's that bright yellow Rhizocarpon geographicum. And this is through a microscope that's in black and white, so it loses its color. So what you can see is you've got this thick crust of lichen on the top of the rock. The rock is gray, and penetrating down into the rock, 5 millimeters down, are the fungal threads. That's all because of this extracellular digestion. So they can get straight into granite. And anybody's ever had a cold chisel and tried to knock a piece of granite off, you'll know it's not easily done. So these things take a long time to grow, and it's because they're able to push their way grain by grain in between the rock by digesting little bits of the matrix away as they penetrate between the grains of rock. And so they begin that process of soil formation. Another part of this story is that they can stabilize soils. So those microscopic threads, they can penetrate between rock grains, but they can also knit together grains of soil. And that's a really important thing they do in deserts and in alpine systems. And for those of you who are aware of the importance of soil and our human desire to not let it blow away, it is really important to make sure that these cryptogamic crusts and coverings and deserts are able to persist. And there's a big campaign in the desert southwest of the United States called Don't Bust the Crust. So if you stepped on one of these crusts, you would break apart those grains and the wind would be able to blow it away, which would be pretty terrible because it takes thousands of years for these soils to actually form in those dry conditions. What else do? They add nitrogen to ecosystems. So that's especially true where rainfall is high. Inorganic forms of nitrogen can be washed away very easily. So out in the West Coast, where we have huge amounts of rainfall, what we call the leaching, the effect of just washing away the nutrients, is incredibly strong. And so we have a lot of lichens out west that grow with cyanobacteria inside their bodies. So if you look at my lungwort, so this beautiful big green leafy lettuce-like thing on the tree, if you take a cross section of it, you can see the green cells of its photosynthetic algae. This is a reproductive structure, but this kind of blackish green structure on the underside, that's a nodule of cyanobacteria. So this fungus has two partners. It has a carbon fixing green alga, and it has a nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria. And lots of lichens out west where there's high rainfall will have nitrogen fixers in their bodies. Some of them as the primary symbiont, and sometimes like this one as a secondary symbiont. And these can be important nitrogen inputs especially in the rainforests, not just in the UK, but in temperate rainforests worldwide. This is a phenomenon that comes up over and over again, where you have cyanobacteria inside the body of the lichen, and they can contribute 10 to 15% of the local nitrogen into the system. So it's a really important part of the local ecology. Probably all of you heard about lichens in school, right? And you probably heard, if you did know something about their ecology, you probably heard something about how they're sensitive to air quality, and they're very sensitive to air quality. So here's a figure that just shows just how sensitive they are. On the left-hand side of the figure is a map made by a government expert group, the Transboundary Air Pollution Group, showing sulfur dioxide, which is one of the main pollutants in acid rain. And that's from 2001. So although the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, I think 1970 exactly, there's still problems with SO2, which was one of the main things that was regulated. And even now, the SO2 in the atmosphere pretty much mirrors the urban agglomerations of human impact, basically. So in this, on the left, you see where most people live and where most pollution is. And on the right, you can see a map that was created by 15,000 school children in the 1970s. They went out, they counted how many lichens they had, and they drew them on a map. Actually, Oliver Gilbert drew them on a map. And what you can see is that there were no lichens in parts of the country that correspond to huge urban centers, or, for example, up in Fort William, where the smelter was. So it mirrors point sources of pollution really carefully, very closely. And the number and the diversity of lichens mirrors that air quality, the ways to describe air quality, all the different pollutants would map on in a very similar way. And I'm sure you will have heard about the very sad story a couple of years ago about the little girl in London whose was the first case to be legally attributed to air pollution. So she died because the air quality where she lived was terrible. But unfortunately, that's not a special case. 33,000 premature deaths a year are attributable to air pollution. It's massive, and there's lots of evidence for this. It's bad for all of us. It's bad for the environment, and it's bad for people. And the lichens will tell you this. So I always feel a little bit bad when I go out into my neighborhood and I find actually there are no lichens where I live because I live near Ferry Road. Any of you from North Edinburgh will know Ferry Road, you know, not a great place. So as a lichenologist living in a place with basically one of these black zones, what can I do? We're all limited by our own situations, I suppose. So following on with that story about air quality, so sulfur dioxide and particulate matter has been pretty strongly regulated, and there have been big improvements in those. But now we have a new air quality problem, again, which is now being regulated, which is nitrogen, especially in the form of ammonia. And for those of you who've been out near the bridges or in any agricultural environments, you'll know that this orange lichen is absolutely everywhere. I can only imagine that if I was in a room full of you people, you'd all be nodding your heads, oh yes, the orange lichen. So Xanthoria is one of these nitrogen-loving lichens. Historically, it would have only been in places with high levels of nutrients, possibly by the seaside or bird perching rocks. These days, it's becoming just abundant and ubiquitous and spreading all the time. So if you look at where we find it now, it's not just the seasides. This is the city center in Edinburgh, and you can see wherever it can get a little foothold between the cracks and the bricks of buildings, it will start growing there as well. So we've got much better control of the historic pollutants, but now the situation is changing and we have a nitrogen problem. especially down to diesel cars now, but also agricultural pollution in the farms and things with too much slurry and too much burping. But it's not all grim. Lichens also tell us about our woodlands, and they've been studied so well in Britain for such a long time that we can use them as old woodland indicators. As you know, vascular plants and bryophytes can be used, so can lichens. So if you ever see a lichen like this, you know you're in an ancient semi-natural habitat. This is one of quite a few species that have been found only in these semi-natural habitats, ancient semi-natural habitats, and we use them as indicators. And so that's another use that we have. If you're unable to tell something about a woodland just by looking at the structure of it, have a look at the epiphytes and see how diverse they are, and see if you find special ones. So there's some very well recognized publications by especially folks from the Botanic Garden. So Brian and Sandy Coppins have published a series of ecological indicators, and following that, Chris Ellis and Sally Eaton have been doing similar, testing those ideas and finding that indeed there are quite a few lichens that will serve as very good ecological indicators for everything from stand structure to age to well, it's especially those two, those are the main things, to isolation as well. So how many lichens have we got? In Scotland, we have about 1,600 species out of a UK total of just over 2,000. In the world, it's only about 35,000 species, which is always a surprising figure to me. This is where I would do audience participation. I'd love to know what you folks think, how many fungi there are in the world. So just take a second and think about how many fungi you think there might be. So I'll give you some little background, okay? So far, of all the fungi that are known, half of them are cup fungi, and half of those again are lichens. So put those figures together, and you might get an estimate of what the fungal diversity would be estimated in the world. It would be completely wrong, because we think there are between 2 to 3 million fungal species in the world. So there are far fewer lichens than would be predicted based on what we know already. Partly that's because mostly we know the big and macroscopic fungi, including the lichens. A lot of fungi are microscopic and we just can't see them, so it takes longer to describe them. But there's also, I think, I don't know, there's an inconsistency to me in the number of fungi that we expect to find as lichens. So I think that number is going to go up, because every time anybody looks, we find more and more and more. But we'll see. So anyway, if you're interested in taking up lichens, it's a lot easier job than it would be for vascular plants. In Scotland, it's harder though, sorry. In Scotland, we have 1,600 versus 1,100 native plants in Scotland, and we're doing much better there for a couple of reasons, and I'll tell you why that is. So in Scotland, if I tell you to think of a lichen-rich place, I'm guessing a lot of you would think of a woodland like this with a beautiful old oak, maybe out west where this one was photographed. And that would be a fantastic place to go exploring. But of course, lichens grow from the very tippy tops of our mountains right down to sea level. So on the bottom right, this is seaweed on a rocky shore. And this green stuff, that's a lichen. It's on the lower shore. It's inundated for most of its life. The black stuff, that's a different lichen. There's actually a whole handful of different ones that occur in this zone that are mostly submerged most of their lives. Marine lichens, who would have thought it? There's even ones that grow on the barnacles. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the orange ones and the white ones down on the coast, but they even grow below the mean high tide. So that's interesting. So we have a lot of different habitats, and we have a very rich diversity of lichens in Scotland, especially when you consider that we have a tiny landmass, right? So in Scotland, we have less than 1% of Europe's landmass, but 37% of Europe's lichen diversity. So how can we account for that? It's diverse habitats, that's huge, right? We're not exactly landlocked. We've got the coast, we've got the mountains, and we've got everything in between. But the other two factors that I've listed are really important too. And one is this low intensity land management. Scotland has low population numbers and relatively low impacts of land management compared with the rest of Europe. Maybe not compared with everywhere in the world, but certainly compared with the rest of Europe. And we have a legacy of clean air, just by dint of being right here beside the coast with southwesterlies, bringing the nice clean air off the sea. So just spend a minute on that clean air story, because it's huge. You keep hearing me talk about it, don't you? So here's a twig from the city centre in Edinburgh. That's not what a twig should look like. That's what a twig should look like, right? Look at that. That's what a twig should have. It should have bryophytes, it should have lichens, it should have spiders, it should have all sorts of invertebrates growing on it. And that's the difference between clean air and dirty air. So if we just go back and revisit this picture for just a minute, let's look at Scotland. Let's focus in on that. And on the left-hand side, all those blue colors, that is below the lowest sort of standard level of sulfur dioxide. It's sort of considered clean. So we've got clean air in most of Scotland. And we have had that ever since the last, well, ever, right? So there's never been a history of air pollution across most of Scotland. That's huge in a European context. There's very few places like that. And if we think about that overlaid with some huge ecological gradients like rainfall, you can start to see why this is important. So on the right-hand side, we have a rainfall map. I'm sure some of you have seen maps like this before, but I've blown up the legend on the left so you can see just how wide this rainfall gradient is. In the west, we have places between 1.7 to 4.5 meters of rain. That's incredible. There are not a lot of places that have that much rainfall. And then all the way down to 600 or 700 millimeters on the east coast where we are. So that west coast is really important in having a very different suite of organisms, all organisms, not just lichens, but you can see how steep that gradient is from the west to the east. We also have the altitudinal gradient. So we have Arctic habitats. So on the top right, you can see a polar projection of the Earth with the Arctic Circle and the outline for Arctic habitats. The UK sits well below that, well south of that, but that doesn't matter because our mountains kind of poke up into it. And here's the top of the the plateau on Benavert in late May, a few years back. It's not a warm place. The average mean temperature just hovers barely above freezing, and the winds are scouring up there. It's a tough place to live, and not many things can survive. And so the bryophytes and lichens tend to dominate in those Arctic habitats. Alpine and Arctic habitats. Some of the species, if you've ever been lucky enough to get up onto the plateaus to see these things, there's the one on the lower left called easy lichen. There's a crazy common name for you. It's easy because when it curls up, when it's dry, it's bright orange underneath. That's really what it looks like. And when it's wet, the whole thing looks orange because you can see through to the orange color. Then there's mountain worms, otherwise called snow tea. They just look like little white worms. It's a very strange lichen, Thamnolia vermicularis, named after the worm-like look. And then maybe one of the most iconic of our Arctic alpine species is this Flavocytraria nivalis. So if you have a look at the distribution of that, here it is just on the tops of the plateau in the Cairngorms and a few other outlying mountains. So this thing has a very northern distribution and is very much, if you look at a polar projection of these kind of Arctic alpine lichens, it looks like this. So we kind of just sneak in here. This is not the same species, but a similar Arctic alpine where we have these things that you might not expect from our latitude. So if we think about diverse habitats again, the UK has an important responsibility for conservation. So internationally, we have responsibility for over 100 lichens. And a huge number of those come from the temperate rainforest. So if we just spend a little minute on that, here's what the temperate rainforest distribution looks like worldwide. It's the dark green areas on this map, and you can see how restricted it is globally. It's less than 1% of the land area of Earth. And in Europe, we have very little of it. It looks like we have more than you might think. So the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula, a little bit of Brittany, the coast of Norway, a lot of Ireland traditionally would have been, or historically would have been covered in rainforest, and then the western fringes of the mainland of the UK. But unfortunately, a lot of these places have been really heavily disturbed. So Norway has hardly any semi-natural habitats in the rainforest zone, same with the Iberian Peninsula, and Scotland has the best examples of this stuff. So even though it might not look like we have a lot. They're really important internationally. So if we go to that west coast, you'll see why. And it's because we have these forests that we think woodlands, that's my American coming through. I call them forests. We call them woodlands here, don't we, Becky? So the woodlands in the west coast have been presumed to have been in place ever since they first arrived after the last glaciation. So the very first tree to arrive in the UK after the ice melted was hazel. And some people think that those hazel woods are absolutely pristine and have never been touched by development or changes in land use. And it could be that that's the case. It's hard to, roll the clock back and understand that. But from the diversity of the epiphytes, it looks like that is probably the case. It would be really interesting to find out. So these West Coast woods have incredibly high epiphyte diversity, and it's those epiphytes, the things growing on the bark of the trees, that's more important than the trees themselves. It's not huge tree diversity like it is in tropical rainforest. Temperate rainforest instead is known for its epiphyte diversity. These woods too have some really interesting species in them that have tropical affinities, so very strange biogeographic patterns, and some really interesting disjunct distributions that we have here, and then not found again until the Azores and then Chile, some very strange distributions like that. So quite interesting from a biogeographic point of view. I'm sure you're all familiar with this one. This is the lungwort, beautiful photograph by Dave Genny. And this lichen is the iconic temperate rainforest species. It's globally distributed, it's all over the place, but it's quite rare in most of its range. In Europe, it's very rare. It's used as an indicator of old growth woodland. It's used as an indicator of ancient semi-natural habitats, and it's incredibly rare in parts of its range in Europe, to the extent that in Switzerland, they know where every single one is. They know how old they are. They know when they're reproducing. They know the generation time. No one knows the generation time of a lichen, but in Switzerland, we know it takes 30 years for it to start out as a baby and then reproduce with these little orange dots. So this is where the spores are born. In Scotland, on the other hand, it's pretty much a weed. If you go out to the right places, it'll be growing on the phone, on the telephone lines. It'll be growing on your clothes pegs if you leave them out there long enough. It's growing on stones. And it only takes 7 years to reproduce. So it's in absolutely optimal conditions out there. And so the development of the community around these rainforests is just very well, it's very, very well developed and well protected. So it's an important place for lots of species, not just the lungwort. So the speckle bellies are another one of our rainforest specialties. So they're called speckle bellies because if you flip them over, they've got dots on their undersides. These species also have dots on their upper sides. And the big one across the middle of the picture is the golden speckle belly with little yellow dots. This one has a great story about the diversity of fungi generally. So I said before that we probably have underestimated the number of lichens, and this is a case in point. So anything that looks like this, the world over, for 100 years has been called Pseudocyphalaria crocata, the golden speckle belly. Somebody recently started looking at the DNA in there, and they found that actually there's probably a dozen or more lineages that have been separated from each other by millions of years, but there's not much morphological difference. So in fact, what we've been calling Pseudocyphalaria crocata is actually Pseudocyphalaria citrina, and there's a whole bunch of other species around the world that it's very hard to tell them apart. And that kind of story happens over and over again. The Norwegian speckle belly is much more narrowly distributed. It's only found in the Azores, Norway, Scotland, Ireland. I think there's a site in Wales, and then I think there's one in Chile too. Why not, right? So that's an interesting one. But the speckle belly is, when you see a speckle belly, you know you're in the very best of the best for rainforest. So these are quite rare, even in the UK, especially outside of Scotland. But even in Scotland, they tend not to get around very well. They seem to be very poor at dispersing. So they're real habitat specialists. And then we have these guys. These are also typical of the smooth bark in these rainforest habitats, and they're called the smoothies. I like to call them dots and dashes or squiggles and dots because The dots, like I showed you before, are the fruiting bodies of quite a few different lineages that are much more common in the tropics. We have just a few of them here, but they tend to be dominant on the smooth bark when you're out west. So we have the script lichens like this, and then these little dots and dashes. There's one of our endemic species. This is Pyrenula hibernica, sometimes called blackberries and custard. And the smoothies are really interesting. So they're on hazel bark especially, but also on the smooth bark of oaks. And these are those things that I said have the interesting tropical affinity. So just think about the position of Scotland on the globe for a minute. You've got the Gulf Stream washing up through the Atlantic from the warm parts of the tropics in the Americas. And you can only imagine that that warm air occasionally will be bringing spores along with it and giving us these little tastes of what the tropics are like. So if you ever have the chance to go to the tropics, bark like this covered with dots and dashes is just incredibly common. These are the commonest lineages that you go to and see in forests in the tropics by a long way. There's just hundreds and hundreds of species of these things the further south you go. So that's all I'm going to sort of fill your minds with about Scottish lichens. But if you're liking lichens, you can come visit a lichen trail. There's 4 of them at the Botanic Gardens in our regional gardens. The one here in Edinburgh, the one on the far left, it was set up in 2018, and unfortunately one of the trees has come down since then, and because of our capital projects, one of the sites is inaccessible. But I'd still like for people to come and do the trail as much as they can, and all the information in the booklets is still good. So if there's a group who are going out and would like to have a set of these lichen trail booklets, I have them now. You can't get them from the Visitor Welcome Center like you used to be able to at the Botanics. So if you want to get in touch with me, get in touch, and then you can get your own copies of these things. Okay, I'd be really happy for people to use them. The ones at Logan, Benmore, and Doink should still be available from the Visitor Welcome teams in those gardens. But these are by no means the only lichen trails out there, and the British Lichen Society website has a whole new webpage dedicated to where you can find lichen trails across the UK, which is great. If you're really liking them a lot, you can start to identify them. So I did a workshop for the BSBI during lockdown, and that's available on YouTube if you want to try to find that. I've actually had people get in touch from Canada and North Carolina who've seen this thing. So it's working. This is one of the hidden benefits, I guess, of doing things by Zoom, is you can get your workshops out there farther than you would otherwise. So have a look at that, and you can get started with ID. If you decide to invest in some resources, then these FSC guides, they're very good. They're very concise. You know, you get a single habitat, which is a great way to start learning something. So here's, there's lichens on twigs, there's churchyards, there's urban stone. And the nice thing about them is it gives you a small set of common species that you can identify by pictures. And then of course they have the multi-access guides at the back. And the multi-access guides are brilliant because they help you figure out which characters to look at and how to narrow down your choices. So they're great. So I'd strongly recommend those. What else? The British Lichen Society has recently completely revamped the website, and we have a whole bunch of new things accessible for people who are learning. There's an online course, there are local groups, there are Zoom groups, there are lichen, what do they call it? Labs groups, lichens for absolute beginners. It's a real mix of all sorts of resources. And I've talked to a few people lately who've recently joined, and they were really complimentary towards the BLS. So kudos to all the people at the BLS who've worked really hard to make these accessible resources out there on the web to let people get started on their own. And once you've got started, then joining a group so that you can share ideas and bounce ideas around is always good. There's a new lichen. I'll just give a little plump for the Lichens in Southeast Scotland group. There's an interactive map. If you're not from Southeast Scotland, then there's lots of other places shown in green on the BLS website that do have local groups. So, and if you want to start your own in any of these other places, then get in touch. And then what do you do next? Start recording. Honestly, it's the best way to learn. So there'll be lots of people who can support you, and you can record them on your car. That's all I have for you. So thanks very much for your attention. And I can see in the chat that there's a few things that have come through in terms of questions. So I'm really happy to stick around and answer questions for folks.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Becky. That was great. Yeah, absolutely brilliant, frankly. Some kind people have put the name of the Melvin Sheldrake book in the chat, and that's Entangled Life. So if anyone's you want to follow up on that sort of recommendation, it's on my reading list. I haven't actually read it, but I know it's been very well reviewed, and I know various people who have recommended it. Mel Fox has asked, what was the moth in the four photographs that you had? What particular moth was that?
So I don't know the name of that one. It's one of the pugs. It's one of the geometrids, but I don't know the name of that one. Sorry, I'm just getting started on my moths. There's a really famous moth that I should have put a picture of called the Merville de jour, isn't it? The glory of the day. That's a really famous, beautiful thing that's very lichen camouflaged. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just see what else there is here. Hold on a minute. Where are we now? Which Lothian SWT reserves are good for lichens? That may tie in with an event which we're planning. You want to go ahead with that one, Becky?
Well, yeah, so Colin and I were talking about doing a walk up at Red Moss, which is a great place. I've taken a couple of groups up to Red Moss before because it's very accessible and there's some wonderful woodland, and along with heathland, there's an avenue of beaches that's fantastic and some terrestrial communities. So it's got everything. It's a really nice, easy walk and lots of things to see. So I would say that's a brilliant one to start with for sure. What else? Scottish wildlife. I think
well, I was at Woodhall Dean, and I think that's probably quite a good one. I can show you that's a lichen lollipop, I guess you would call that. I don't have any reindeer lurking around, but that was from Woodhall Dean, so that was just basically picked up off the ground. There'll be quite a lot of damage, I'm afraid, with the recent gales. But at least it has the benefit of bringing some stuff in like that, I suppose.
I mean, the answer to the question, though, let me just jump in there, Colin, because I think any of the reserves would be brilliant, but the ones, so Woodhall Dean's really good. That's a great place. And I think the places that have old woodland are the best, really. So the further you kind of get out from the city, the better you'll have. And the answer is that everywhere will have lichens. They just everywhere does. You saw the ones on the car there, and there'll be ones on pavements. So that's something. But in order to get started, it's better to go to a place where there's a lot of biomass and something like that stick that you've picked up, Colin. So there's some common species that are easy to get familiar with, and those would be the ones to start with. Excuse me. So and the way to sort of decide which place to go to, I think, is go somewhere where you can go a lot. And then start with the abundant things. Don't go to a place that has the oldest amazing trees. Like if you go to Caerlaverock out in the southwest, it's amazing, but man, you'll never see those lichens again because the trees are, you've got 600-year-old trees out there, so there's very special things on those trees. And I think when you're starting, it's probably better to go to places that are close by, accessible, and then you can start picking off the easy, common, abundant things, and then not get overwhelmed with a whole bunch of different stuff. If you live near the coast, go to the coast. If you live near a woodland, go to a woodland and get yourself the one FSC guide that applies for your area.
Yeah, and just can I pull a bit? It would be worth investing in a decent hand lens. Is that something that's? It
is so worth investing in a small hand lens. So I buy hand lenses by the quantity. So I buy them for £3 a piece or something like that from UK Geology. They have a really good supply of pretty cheap lenses that are all you actually need. The natural history booksellers have a huge range of great lenses too, and some of them have lights. So if you're willing to spend £3, you can get a decent lens. If you're willing to spend £12, you can get a great lens. So if you think you're going to get into something where you're going to need magnification, so bryology, moths, lichens, fungi, plants, any of those things, I bought myself some lenses when I was in university, which was a fair while ago, and I still have them. So I would, if you're going to do it, get yourself a good one, because you'll see that much more. So even though, you know, you can do a lot with a cheap lens, get yourself a good 10x lens. Do I even have any in my office right now? No. Because it makes a huge difference. And the better the optics, the more you'll see. So get yourself a triplet lens if you can afford it. That'll be 30 pounds or something without a light. So sometimes I go on some of the websites just to see what people are offering. And so that's a crazy thing that I got for £5. It's got a light, 5 whole pounds. The optics are not great, right? But hey, it's got a light. And if you use just the center of it, then the distortion isn't too bad.
Yeah, yeah.
But definitely go for a lens like this. So a proper kind of jeweler's loop rather than the big, you don't want like the Sherlock Holmes thing. That doesn't give you the magnification you need. You need 10x.
At least 10, yeah. Okay, well that's cool. I mean, I know there's quite a few places. I think the RSPB shop on Rose Street has, and the SOC, they also have SOC at Waterston House. They also have a range of optics and hand lenses. So those are, I suppose the good thing is you can actually try it before you buy, as opposed to have it, you know, although you'll probably pay a bit more, unfortunately, inevitably, than you might be able to get on the internet.
But that's a great idea.
Yeah,
Rose Street's really good.
Yeah. Someone, let's see, John Kerry has said, I like lichens, but I like gravestones too. What intervention would you tolerate that would help to make a lichen encrusted gravestone readable? And I know that's a topic that has, you know, other people have mentioned. In fact, I was out a graveyard in near Dunsire today, and some very old gravestones out there, and quite a lot of lichens. Couldn't read what was on the stone. So yeah, what would you suggest there?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. There's a bit of tension there, obviously, because people don't like to lose the ability to read the stones, obviously. But like I showed you with that slide where the fungal threads are penetrating 5 millimeters down into rock, even if you pressure wash it, you're not getting rid of it, right? And you're probably going to damage it more than you would if you just left it intact. And at a certain point, the lichens become protective. So if you want to protect the stones early, I mean, the best thing to do is clean them before they get colonized. So those shiny stones that are nice and clean, they're harder, you know, the spores just don't stick. They don't stick, and that's why they stay clean until that upper surface starts to get pitted, and then things start sticking and growing. But cleaning old gravestones often does more damage than good, really. So you've got to watch that. And I think a lot of churchyard conservation organizations are coming around to the idea that you're probably going to do more damage than otherwise. Although a lot of them, what they did was they gave them a clean, they did some transcription, and then they said, we're going to just have to let it go now. So it's always difficult, that. And there's a big science of biodeterioration on stone. And, you know, different stones will have different degrees of susceptibility because of the hardness, because of the chemical composition. So all sorts of different reasons that they'll have different communities on them. But you know, the point is that even if you have them on there and you think you're going to clean them, you're not really going to clean them off. They'll just come back because they're in there between the grains anyway. So that's not easy. Yeah.
There are some questions, I guess, which don't have, there is no perfect answer, and that might be well. Another question, Sabira Sheikh. Sometimes a tree has many different lichens and moss on one and a nearby one similar, which receives the same, which appears to be the same, receives the same amount of rain, and all the rest of it has none. Is there any reason for that? Do lichens prefer certain types of tree, or?
That is so interesting. So one of the places I used to take people was the Birkwood, the Birks of Aberfeldy, a beautiful birchwood. And you know, it's old, it's in clean air area, there's just lichens dripping off the trees, and there's this one birch tree that has nothing. You know, why does that one birch tree have nothing? And I think the answer is because of the particular chemistry of that tree. And that's really interesting. So there was a study done by one of my colleagues here at the Botanic Garden, and they had this fantastic natural experiment well, sort of natural experiment, thanks to the Forestry Commission, who gathered a bunch of clones of aspen all across the range of I think, Scotland. And they planted the clones in 2 different places, one in the northeast of Scotland and one in the southwest of Scotland. So totally different habitat conditions, rainfall, temperature, but the exact same aspen clones in these 2 different places. And then 30 years later, there was this amazing experiment. Well, what are the lichens on those aspens? And it turns out that the lichens that are on the aspen clones in the 2 different places are more similar to each other than the lichens within the places, despite the fact that the climates are totally different. So actually, the chemistry and the genetics of the individual aspen clone determine what lichens are on them. It's an individual response to the tree. And part of it's chemistry, but the chemistry was investigated in that study, and they weren't able to actually identify what the bark chemistry was that related here, but it was seemingly about the genetics of the tree, and they didn't know how that sort of filtered down to the conditions that the lichens were responding to. So really interesting question, and we don't quite know how that works yet.
Mm. Yeah, so plenty more to research there then, I guess. Another question here from Graham Russell. Have lichen distributions been used to work out how wide belts of trees need to be to absorb nitrogen pollution? There are parts of Edinburgh that are surprisingly rich in lichens.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to it. I only have anecdotal observations similar probably to yours that made you ask that question. But obviously in the middle of the Botanic Garden, we've got a lot of lichens, and it's pretty rich actually, 70 odd species at least. And in the 1970s, there were 3. So, it's a massive change, and it's down to the changes in pollution environment. But how big that sort of shelter belt needs to be, I'm not familiar with the literature, but there probably is literature about that because it's well studied. It's just not my field.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that is quite astonishing, isn't it, to increase from 3 to 70 or whatever. And I was actually in a moss identification thing recently at the Water Leith Centre, and there was one particular moss that the guy was mentioning and said it really wasn't, it was very rare when you had lots of coal smoke, obviously, and now it's incredibly common. So, I suppose that shows how effective the the sort of anti-air pollution things can be. We just need to perhaps look at other sources of pollution now.
Yeah.
So the next one is this Glenn Kusker. I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing that name properly, but anyway, given how ancient our yews are, what relation do they have with lichens? Is there?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. So yew trees have pretty limited value for lichens for a couple of reasons. One is because the canopy is so dense. So it's so dark under the canopy of a yew tree that photosynthesis is limited for their little algal partners. So most of the time you don't find a lot of great lichens on yew trees unless they're the kind of open canopy varieties. The other thing is that the bark of yew is often quite acid. And so again, that sort of just narrows the field of who's available and who can tolerate those conditions. So even though they tend to be quite ancient, or they can grow to be quite ancient, they tend not to be brilliant for lichens, actually. Yeah.
That's counterintuitive, perhaps, in a way. There is. I suppose that just again shows the as you say, the chemical relationship of the lichen to the trees. And actually, here's another question from Michaela Sistri. Why is the chemistry of substrate so important for a lichen if the lichen is not taking energy from the substrate or nutrition?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. I love this question because there are very few lichens where sort of chemical tracer studies have been done to show exactly what is coming from where. So the received wisdom has always been that lichens need nothing but a little bit of dust and a little bit of water, right? And then they're ready to go. And that's true for sure for the species that have been studied, because you can do a tracer study and you can show that they're actually taking nothing except for what's coming from the atmosphere. For example, Cladonia mats in the heathland are one of the examples where you might think that they're absorbing nutrients from the ground because they're connected to the ground, but in fact they're not. They, all of the nitrogen comes in from the atmospheric deposition. So that's quite interesting. And they're recycled internally. But then there's the observation from the tropics, particularly, where you have these smooth bark lichens, where they don't make spores unless they're on living green wood. And so why is that? That's very curious to me. So all the graphids, all those squiggles, you can collect a fallen twig and it will have absolutely no spores in it because it's dead. Whereas a fresh twig that's just cut off the tree or a bit of bark that's sliced off green will have spores in it because it's still alive. So to me, there's a really open question about which lichens actually don't need anything but dust and which lichens maybe are taking a little bit of something from what they're growing on. And I have to assume that with 35,000 species, they have different strategies for nutrition. The ones that are growing on rock, they're clearly interacting with the rock because some will only grow on calcareous, rich kind of mortar or calcareous sandstone or limestone, whereas the other, other species will only be on acid rock. So there's something going on. Is it a toxicity effect where they actually can't tolerate this or that, or is it that they require something out of it? And again, that's an open question. Very few species have been studied in that fine physiological detail. PhD topic, ready, waiting, come on.
Okay, thanks. Right, next question. I lost this now. Oh, sorry. This is again from Glenn Kusker asking about the particular study which you mentioned about the relation of pollution to the number of lichens, and he's asking how do they factor in density of school children undertaking the survey? With fewer children in areas with better air quality. So yeah,
that's interesting. So that's true. I guess the you might worry then that the bias would be that the students from low population areas with fewer kids would find fewer lichens, but that's exactly the reverse of what they found. So in urban areas where there's lots of people, they found no lichens, whereas out in the countryside, you go out and all the study did, it was ask the students, you didn't have to name them, you didn't have to identify them, it was how many different types can you find? And if you found 0, then you get a black spot on your map. And if you found more than, I can't remember what the categories were, it was like 1 to 3 and 4 to 6, and then more than 8 or something like that. So, these people were not identifying a huge range of species, but it was very obvious that there was hardly anything. And what was going on back in from the 50s to the 70s was that in the urban areas, there was a single lichen that could tolerate that amount of acid. So there was this one species that just blossomed and filled all the available niches that had been vacated by the other species that couldn't deal with it and were all killed by that level of acidity. And so, the expectation was 0 or 1.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah, so the fact, if you remove that pollution, then they do come back to an extent. So, I suppose that's a positive sign.
Definitely. Yeah, that's right. I mean, all of London, if you put in, it's really interesting. So if you put in a new tree that has young, smooth bark and you let it grow up for 40, 50 years, then it doesn't have that legacy effect of the acidification of the bark. But the old trees, all the old trees they're buffering with all the acid that sort of landed on the bark. It's still in there. Right. And so the old trees don't have much on them, but the younger trees are starting to recover.
Oh, well, that's something.
Right. Give us another few hundred years and then we'll get there. Then we'll have the nitrogen problem and then we'll get to the next one. And if we live so long, right?
Another question, which I think is going to tax my pronunciation a bit, but I'll do my best. To Sam Ebden, are there differences between lichenized fungi of the same species that have different endosymbionts?
Well done.
I'm not.
That's right. So there's a great case of this where I showed you the example of the tree lungwort that has green algae in most of its lobes, but then has these little nodules of the cyanobacteria. There's some lichens that can be lichenized either entirely with green algae or entirely with cyanobacteria. And in that case, they look quite different. So the ones with cyanobacteria as the primary endosymbiont, the main symbiotic partner, those would be kind of brownish or dark green, whereas the ones that would have a green algal symbiont, that's the primary symbiont, would be bright green. So they have different morphologies and different colors if the primary symbiont is from a different kingdom. But if it's the same, if it's green algae, but they're different species of green algae, they look the same, you can't tell them apart. They might have different physiology, and they will, because different algae, different species of algae have different, you know, photosynthetic optima and temperature optima and all that kind of thing, but they don't look different unless they're from different kingdoms. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, well, it makes sense to me, but then, you know, or it makes as much sense as it will at the moment. I'll go away and have to obviously go to the British Lichen Society site and do a bit more study, I guess. But anyway, I think we probably are just coming to the end of the questions. There are lots of comments about how much people have enjoyed the talk. And obviously thanking you for the presentation, which has indeed been absolutely fascinating, I must say. I mean, I know very little about lichens personally, but it's always, you know, when you go to somewhere that the trees are absolutely festooned with lichens, it's always fascinating. And I'm actually, as it happens, I'm going to Argyll next week, so I'll be having a look around. Whether, you know, I won't unfortunately have time to get any ID things before I go, but nevertheless, you know, it'll give me something to think about. But anyway, that's been absolutely brilliant, Rebecca. Becky, that's I think, you know, it really has been a tremendous sort of tour de force of all the richness of lichens and their importance in you know, the ecology of particularly obviously Scotland, which is good to know. Can I just say thank you on behalf of SWT. If people want to unmute and clap or express their, you know, do the wee emojis, that'd be fine. But on that note, I think we'll finish up. We haven't got a date, I should say, for the walk at Red Moss and Bayvlaw, but we'll discuss. Rebecca and I can discuss that and hopefully get some in the diary before too long. Because I think people would be really interested in going somewhere like that, and that I know is I mean, I was there fairly recently as well, and again, you know, it struck me as being a place with a good range of lichens, very obvious. So yeah, I think good place to go. But anyway, thanks very much, Becky. It's been absolutely tremendous, and yeah, we'll follow up on the walk at some point.
Sounds good. Thanks very much for having me. Good night, everyone.
Not at all. Okay, good night. And thanks everybody for coming along. So hopefully you'll join us at some other events soon.
Sounds good. Hope to see you then. Bye.
Okay, bye. Yes.